Okay, shall we get started? We're really delighted to welcome Willi Goetschel to participate in our ongoing lecture series on, Kant's both Kant's limitations and his, kind of radical potential in the current moment. Hang on, let me just let in a couple stragglers. Willi Goetschel is a professor of German and philosophy at the University of Toronto, and he's the author of Heine and Critical Theory, The Discipline of Philosophy and the Invention of Modern Jewish Thought, Spinoza's Modernity, Mendelssohn, Lessing, and Heine, and Constituting Critique, Kant's writing as Critical Praxis. He's the editor of the collected works of Hermann Levin Goldschmidt and an editor of the Germanic Review, and currently he's finishing a book with the title Difference and Alterity in La Boétie, Montaigne, Spinoza, Mendelssohn. Thank you so much for doing this, Willi, and please take it away.
Well, thank you first for having me, if only virtually. And we were just talking, of course, it would be wonderful to travel to the Middle East, which right now I would say is maybe safer than the United States in some ways. And I'm really thankful to have this chance. When we talked about it, I thought it was a pure academic exercise, but unfortunately, the political edge of Kant is clearer than ever right now. I was thinking about, at some point, the critique of regional reason that is running around in Kant. And this is not explicitly, but it's baked in this run of the paper. So I'm very happy to share this with you. And it was also a nice chance after a long time to go back to revisit Kant and looking at this just like in a different way. And it's always amazing with Kant how fresh he is. To start with, which is not in my manuscript, I like Goethe's image where he says, whenever you read a page of Kant, it's like you enter a lit room, a brightly, nicely lit room. So Critique and Enlightenment, Kant's project of emancipation. What is critique? We all would like to know. How does it work? What can it do? While this might sound like an academic exercise, returning to Kant helps us understand the profound topicality of these questions at the current juncture. As a spoiler alert, I should mention, however, that critique is of course not the panacea for all the problems we face. On the other hand, it gets only as good as it can get. But this is, as we will see, no small feat, given that the emancipatory impulse critique is capable to mobilize, both when it comes to theory as well as practice. Critique is maybe the most productive contribution Kant has bequeathed to us, and its legacy has a remarkably enduring staying power. Critique has become so entrenched in current discourse, academic as well as political, esoteric and popular, that its particular emancipatory edge often gets lost. This is unfortunate, but the tremendous cachet critique continues to command is a reminder that its significance goes beyond its simple instrumentalization as a catchword. The rich reception history of critique saw the fate of critique rise and fall, taking on a steadier course as Kant's approach gained more widespread currency. In the wake of Kant, the early German Romantics gave critique a first popular run, making the critical momentum of their literary intervention the salient point of their project. Now, a decisive next move was Marx's embrace of critique as a formative practice. Broadcasting his allegiance to the critical project in his early essay toward a critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx highlights the explosive dynamics of critique's power in the following way, and I quote, and that's basically a wonderful definition of what is critique. We have to make these petrified social relations dance by singing to their own tune. Marx famously expanded the reach of critique to, I quote again, everything that exists, asserting, I quote, critique must not be afraid of its own conclusions, nor of conflict with the powers that be. Read with the Kantian emancipatory agenda in mind, Marx's project turns out to be critical in the Kantian sense. It recovers the political thrust while lending new meaning to the force of critique. When Marx recaptures the political edge of the power of critique, he remains arguably in line with Kant, for whom, as we will see, the political had always been inseparable from critique's epistemological and metaphysical agenda. As the young Kant famously noted on his way to working out the first critique, Rousseau set me aright. Turning to the material base of consciousness, Marx recuperates the materially radical edge of Kant's epistemologically critical project and brings it to its fruition. And consistent with the Kantian turn, Marx notes in a hidden political writing, I quote, genuine critique does not analyze the answers, but the questions. From Marx onwards, the reception leads to Nietzsche and Freud entering a new phase with Walter Benjamin, Max Horkheimer, and Theodor W. Adorno. Critical theory in its various contemporary figurations and critical thinking relies on the Kantian gesture to make the examination of one's own epistemological framework the necessary condition of what is critique. Today, critique has been turned into a label with a rich literary cachet. Endowed with the legacy of a tradition with striking firepower, the title Critique of has come to command immediate attention and undivided awe. But while the prestige that comes with the title and its legacy is unquestionable, its inflationary use has on the other hand produced diminishing returns, where critique has become depleted as a rhetorical exercise in demonstrating a profound misunderstanding of the very project of critique. Not only do we have more parodies of critiques and even critiques of critiques of critiques of critiques, and you can go on. There's, by the way, a new book that I saw now by Stanford University Press. I won't name the other, which is called Critique of Critique. See a profound misunderstanding of the entire thing, praised by everybody in the field almost. So we have more of those than we might care. But such attempts cannot even, unfortunately, claim any sort of originality. For already Kant's contemporaries, Hamann and Herder, saw the, I quote, metacritiques they published misfire, while Marx and Engels mocked 2 generations later their opponents, Bruno Bauer and company, for tendering their critical critiques. But if Kant's legacy has come under pressure, this ultimately only demonstrates its continuing relevance, because they all try to live off this cachet. The title or phrase of Kant's first 2 critiques, Critique of Pure Reason, respectively Critique of Practical Reason, indicates a 2-directional genitive construction. A critique of reason, the title also spells the meaning of a critique by reason, and as a result, as an irreducible nexus between the two. In other words, for Kant, critique and reason are inextricably linked. Critique, the way Kant proposes it, produces its protocol in the process of the examination of its object, which in this context is connected to the subject or agent of undertaking this examination. The linkage of the objective genitive, the critique of reason as its object, and its subjective genitive, the critique by reason as the critique's agent, creates a turn to self-reflection that will remain the trademark of critique. The 2-directional feature defines critique from the start as a project that must remain mindful of the conditions of its own mode of operation. As we follow Kant into the text, this turn expands into what the preface to the 2nd edition of the first critique describes as a revolution in thinking. Taking the cue for change from the view that the universe revolves around the Earth and replacing it with a view more attuned to the challenges the obsolete model posed, the Earth, along with the other planets and heavenly bodies, revolves around the sun, Kant proposes we try otherwise. That is, to see whether a change in perspective might yield a more accurate result in observation. As the preface to the second edition of the First Critique notes, and I quote here the famous passage, hence, let us once try whether we don't get further with the problems of metaphysics by assuming that the objects must conform to our cognition, which would agree better with the requested possibility of an a priori cognition of them, which is to establish something about objects before they are given to us. This would be just like the first thoughts of Copernicus, who, when he did make good progress in explanation of the celestial motions, if he assumed that the entire celestial host revolves around the observer, tried to see if he might not have greater success if he made the observer revolve and left the stars at rest. Kant then proposes the thought experiment to do the same with regard to knowledge more generally. As he continues now, I quote, now in metaphysics, we can try in a similar way regarding the intuition of objects. If intuition has to conform to the constitution of the objects, then I don't see how we can know anything of them a priori. But if the object as an object of the senses conforms to the constitution of our faculty of intuition, then I can very well represent this possibility to myself. The Kantian revolution demarcates a decisive departure from traditional thinking. Taking the cue from the Copernican revolution that changed from the solar to a planetary position of the observer here on Earth, Kant's epistemological revolution signals a decisive reconceptualization of the semantics of the term revolution itself. For Kant's epistemological revolution implies a substantive turn in how to understand revolution as no longer simply a change in attitude when it comes to theory. Kant's revolution in thinking carries with its radical epistemological shift implications that no longer allow cordoning off its political dimension. More radically, Kant's revolution in thinking prompts us to connect the dots between his philosophical turn, this philosophical turn, and the broader political ramification they entail. This nexus is often implicit, but there are a few passages that communicate the political implication of Kant's project, albeit with circumspect caution. The critical point in Kant is, however, that the political argument is structurally built in the philosophical argument. Kant's whole approach rejects any form of abstraction or distillation into a seemingly purely philosophical argument separate from its political implications. We can only appreciate the full thrust of Kant's project if we grasp his occasionally underhanded but conceptually succinct way to sustain the politico-philosophical nexus. Of course, the concept of critique is the central term doing the work here. Innocuously packed away in a footnote in the preface to the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant highlights the larger context of his project in a strikingly bold manner, and you all know the passage, but it bears to revisit it again and again, and it goes like that. Our age is the genuine age of critique, to which everything must submit. Religion, through its holiness, and legislation, through its majesty, seek to exempt themselves from it. But in this way, they excite a just suspicion against themselves and cannot lay claim to that unfeigned respect that reason grants only to that which has been able to withstand its free and public examination. You have the entire project of the critique in this, in a nutshell. We could not describe Kant's program more succinctly than this short passage that invokes the key operative terms of Kant's vision of the project of enlightenment. It is in this concluding part of the first footnote to the preface to the first edition of the first critique that Kant gives us, by the way, and in passing, a hint of what is to come in the over 800 pages to follow in the original editions of the work. A book that initiated not only a new philosophical mode of thinking, but also a new literary form and genre. With the first critique became not only the watchword of new generations of thinkers, but also the model for how to write henceforth critically. That is, in a way that would meet the turn invoked by the meet the criteria of the turn invoked by the two-directionality of the first critique's titular genitives. Our age is the genuine age of critique to which everything must submit. For Kant, this sentence signals a new age in which any sort of legitimacy depends on the requirement to pass the test of universal acceptance. And I can't but stress the cheekiness of this line. It is extremely powerful and it's just stunning. And basically, I try now to unpack it. No assumption, no presupposition, no claim is any longer valid without examination of the form of its justification for the entire theopolitical complex, you could say. And so critique turns first to the examination of reason itself, a turn Kant calls transcendental because it now investigates the parts that together combine to a complex structure, leading us to produce what we call knowledge. All we have to start with, Kant holds, is the a priori of what he calls pure reason, that is the formal epistemological schematism that organizes the empirical data of our sense perception. The upshot of this investigation is that the conditions of the possibilities of our knowledge has strict limits. We can say what we can know and we can say what we cannot know. While we do have so-called a priori knowledge, the range of this form of a priori knowledge is rigorously limited itself and doesn't pertain to things, objects, or the world, but only to the forms through which our epistemological apparatus produces knowledge. Everything else rests on the way in which we synthetically process the data of our senses, on which we depend to experience the world, that is, to have knowledge of our world. And with that comes, of course, a complete rethinking or a revolution of the very concept of what is experience. This technical limitation means that there's no hidden, no secret knowledge that is the prerogative of experts with any sort of privileged access to higher truth that could not be shared with anybody else. For so-called a priori reason functions across the board along the same protocol. As a result, any claim henceforth that reason wishes to advance requires ratification with regard to the justification of its grounds, that is, a critical examination. The critical method thus functions by reflecting on its own procedure. Critique is consistently a consistently self-reflective operation. Because it continually reflects and makes transparent its own conditionality, its legitimacy derives from the openness of its self-reflective procedure. It derives its legitimacy, in other words, from its continuous effort at scrutinizing the conditions for the possibility to argue its claims. The critical method advances successfully only as it reflects on its own limits. That is, the moment critique overreaches it into speculation, norm building and so forth, it loses its critical force. Critique then is not a magic bullet, but more like an act of disenchantment. Critique doesn't destroy its opponents, but has them self-destruct before their own eyes as the ground on which they insist to stand tall caves in under the excess weight of their unexamined assumptions and preposterous presuppositions. But if Kant succeeds so successfully in philosophy, we might wonder whether his approach continues to have any promise when it comes to politics and things more generally. True, we saw Marx and critical theory embrace critique with great enthusiasm. But is Kant's legacy really still alive besides the continuous recourse to the appeal of critique as battle cry? To see for ourselves, let us return to the passage earlier cited from the footnote to the first critique. Our age is the genuine age of critique, to which everything must submit, religion through its holiness and legislation through its majesty seek to exempt themselves from it. And we see it right now across the world, these sentences. We thought for decades this is antiquated. But in this way, they excite, I continue Kant, a just suspicion against themselves, and cannot lay claim to that unfeigned respect that reason grants only to that which has been able to withstand its free and public examination. Neither religion nor legislation can command respect based on any claim to legitimacy that is not backed by the free and public examination. But what then are we to understand by free and public examination? Kant gives us a first answer in the book this quote prefaces. He develops his that we just saw. So the Critique of First Reason is a first run. He develops his answer somewhat in his Enlightenment essay 3 years later, but the issue sticks with much of Kant's writing until his last publication, The Conflict of the Faculties. There and throughout much of his writing, Kant keeps returning to this question as a theme central to his project. And the reason is because he can never resolve it fully. And we can blame him, nobody has. We are all laboring around it. And the rest of the talk will show how that works. In the first critique, Kant develops a model of the adequate use of reason that takes its cue in crucial aspects from the idea of a court of justice, that reason, as it were, presides, in which all arguments are heard, weighed, and sorted out on the basis of their merits. In this context, Kant stipulates that the only competent judge to do this is, I quote, no other judge than universal reason itself. Qualifying his statement in a decisive way by completing the line in the following way, and here comes the punchline of this really, no other judge than universal reason itself, in which everyone has a voice. If it remains ultimately an unresolved issue, how exactly to think universal reason and what that exactly means, everyone has a voice in it. The point here is that Kant's idea of universal reason highlights a problem that continues to present an enduring challenge. Part of Kant's answer to resolve this challenge is to point to the need to find models of open discourse in which, as he formulates, everyone really has a voice, and really everyone. His peacekeeping approach in the critique and in philosophy more generally is to establish the parameters for the conditions in which such a free and public examination is possible in the first place. Read this way, the first critique is indeed a signpost to emancipation and empowerment, as it was also correctly understood by most of its readers. It establishes a level playing field where we face the challenge of negotiating the reach of reason with the challenge of accommodating everyone's voice, really. Ultimately, this is an open-ended process, a work in progress that prohibits closure. And this is precisely the solution, if we wish to call it that, the philosophically stringent argued point that reason is no longer a property, but shows itself ultimately as a faculty that manifests itself in practice, a practice based on consultative rather than dictatorial forms of interaction. Rather than following paradigms of supreme authority, Kant describes reason as a complexly differentiated self-constitutive process whose legislative power rests on a Rousseau-inspired notion of the general will. But in Kant, the claims of reason remain open to an interminable form of self-examination that keeps the model in check, unlike with Rousseau. Kant's approach thus steers in its critical mode away from the concessions to any form of decisionism, supreme authority, or dictatorial aspiration of reason, which in Kant's view can only end in appropriation of reason for exclusionary purposes and would therefore end up with an amputated or otherwise mutilated form of reason. The trajectory of the first critique points to such an inclusive vision of reason as a task, an interminable project and work in progress, rather than an achievement that has been already accomplished. If Kant relies in the critique of pure reason much on jurisprudential metaphors to make this point, including the idea that the critique is like a court of justice, he offers another model in his Enlightenment essay, an answer to the question, what is enlightenment? 3 years after the publication of the first critique, Kant breaks his argument down in terms of a program of enlightenment, outlining how reason works, as it were, in action. The essay illustrates the pronounced political dimension of the first critique, which read with the Enlightenment essay in mind becomes even more pronounced in its commitment to enlightenment as a conduit to emancipation. Its opening salvo, that you all probably know, bears attention despite the customary trivialization that comes with the canonical cachet it has commanded for almost 2 centuries and a half. And there's a relatively fresh translation in the Cambridge translation of Kant's political philosophy. And I just changed it a little bit in terms of gender politics, but it goes like that. Enlightenment is the human being's emergence from its self-incurred minority. The German term here for minority, literally infancy, Unmündigkeit is infancy, the state of a child's inability to speak, sets the reader up to think of the word that remains unmentioned, carefully unmentioned here, but suggests itself or imposes itself, if you want, as the term that Kant's phrase of the emergence from legal minority or infancy amounts to, that is, emancipation. Enlightenment, then, is the termination of one's status of a legal minor, in other words, a servant or slave. For this is what the technical term emancipation has always meant. In an interesting way, Kant's opening line intonates the title of Etienne de Boétie's 16th century treatise on voluntary servitude, a call to shaking off one's voluntarily accepted chains of servitude. Boétie was the inspiration that led Montaigne to compose his essays, which after all present over the expanse of 3 volumes and almost 1,000 pages, a sustained variation on the theme of voluntary servitude. Montaigne, it bears to remember, was one of Kant's favorite philosophers and interlocutors, as you could say, and his essays played a crucial role in Kant's development on the way to the critique as a new literary genre. So I think it's not too far-fetched to register in this canonically celebrated line about enlightenment as the emergence from humanity's self-incurred minority or infancy, a deep resonance, and I mean a really deep resonance, with Boétie's theory of liberation, albeit in carefully coded form. Writing 5 years later, the French Revolution, and before the French Revolution, and in a monarchy lacking any parliamentary form of constitution, neither of the French nor British variety, Kant took recourse to their emergent public sphere as a forum for the vetting of free speech. In order to grasp Kant's idea of the function of the public and what constitutes a generally public sphere, we need to look for a moment past the problems that his distinction between public and private poses. Similarly, his exclusive focus on the example of the publication of one's view in print and submission to the public as a text, as authoritative use of public reason, must appear, unfortunately, in today's world as hopelessly antiquated. But if you look at the objective for this line of reasoning, I believe we can still appreciate at a critical point of his approach concerning the public use of reason and the function of the public sphere. If we follow Kant's line that universal human reason must accommodate for everyone's voice, the Enlightenment essays seeks to provide an answer, as Kant writes there. But by the public use of one's reason, I understand that use which someone makes of it as a scholar before the entire public of the world readers. If the Republic of Letters figures here as a model, we need to remember that since the Renaissance and with the rise of book publishing during the Enlightenment, this was more or less the only publicly accessible forum other than the town square. Because of its medialized structure, the world of letters, and particularly the print media in the age when book printing started to reach increasing numbers of readers during the Enlightenment, provided more or less the only palpable or feasible model for thinking the public sphere. Note that the term intellectual was not in currency until the early 19th century in the English language, and not until the end of the 19th century in Germany in a very vexed reception history. The man or woman of letters stood for a writerly voice mediated through a culture of conversation and intellectual exchange that seemed to offer a sound model, at least until the arrival of artificial intelligence and the mirage to do the writing and thinking for us. Like all great philosophical questions, Kant's solution is less important than the way he formulates the problem. The point is then rather that Kant doesn't take the public as agent or as communicative scene for granted. Rather, with Kant, the public arises as a necessary desideratum to constitute the public use of reason as shared space for negotiating the social and political imperatives communally. For Kant, and in difference to Habermas, for instance, the question is less one of communicative action and in identification of the issue in discourse and its regulation, but instead a question concerning the conditions of the possibility for the very creation of the public sphere as a space yet to be realized. While the parameters for the public use of reason are yet to be fully fleshed out, as the project Kant calls Enlightenment, Kant spends more time delineating what he calls the private use of reason. Just like with the scholar or intellectual, the examples he musters here might appear insignificant. The military officer, the cleric, the teacher in employment, or you could the teacher, the university professor. But they represent the three key points of access to the public in the 18th century. The use of reason is defined to reach what remain ultimately captive audiences kept in check by the speaker's authority, endowed by the institutional power and office they hold. Of course, times have changed, and teachers might just dream on that their charges would actually listen to them, and we all know that. What Kant's examples communicate, however, is the point that whoever speaks with a particular form of power invested in them, either as a state, clerical organization, or otherwise, by holding a particular office and thus being granted privileged access and authority, or by otherwise controlling public communication and its media, or even owning it, hint, hint, ends up making private use rather than public use of reason, even if it looks like that. Like it looks public. Closer to home then, the majority of communication forms that define our daily fills or feeds are, according to Kant's criteria, private rather than public. We have a large and arguably dominant private industry that runs what might be mistaken for the public sphere, but turns upon close examination out to be a global network of private industrial outlets. If one broadcasts personal views and opinions by dint of one's access to the public because of one's office as functionary or state or corporate power, this presents in Kant's view not a public but a private use and abuse of reason, and one for that matter that is particularly deceptive as it shields its private interests behind the trappings of the prestige of a public use of reason. Kant's distinction, if problematic otherwise, does, however, the critical work of a distinction whose politically relevant significance we seem to have forgotten in the course of the recent transformation or expropriation of the public sphere by social media into a fragmentized world of mass communication. At the current moment, we experience a development that has been long in the coming. Our public life has become dominated by an increasingly uninhibited desire of privatization of the public sphere. Once conceived as a digital virtual commons, the internet has been turned into a virtual real estate that can be seized, parceled, monetized, and hacked. What once was meant to be a common shared resource has been turned into private property. As consumers of news and information, we have increasingly, if not exclusively, become captive audiences of private industries masquerading as public, while we, of course, cheerfully work hard to provide them all the data they need. The pressures under which the few remaining publicly run news and broadcast services have come is just a symptom of this. Now, with Kant, we could say that just because a public sphere doesn't fully exist the way we envisioned it as necessary condition for enlightenment and appears increasingly to become an impossibility, doesn't mean it's a bad idea. For Kant, it was the necessary condition for critique, enlightenment, and public reasoning to actually exist. In his last publication, the scholar and public intellectual offered another model of how critique and enlightenment can work. Almost a decade after the French Revolution, that introduced a modern model of parliamentary democracy to the European continent, Kant's conflict of the faculties offers a pointedly political version of public use of reason, of the public use of reason argument. In this last writing, Kant examines the function of the university's four faculties, while the higher faculties of the 18th century European university, that is theology, law, and medicine, ranked in hierarchical order, philosophy comprising today's arts and sciences and humanities had as the lowest of the faculties no canonical standing. We can cheerfully say we still don't, which may be a good thing. Kant now turns this marginal position outside the gates of power to the very point of philosophy's reason and necessity to exist. With philosophy, we have something like an institutionally tasked free space for the kind of free and independent thought the higher faculties are unable to provide, for they are functionaries of the canonical law of the church and state. They're agents of power. Only philosophy is exempt from the direct control of the powers that be, for its resistance or apparent uselessness, the privilege of thinking that provides shelter for the freedom of thought. Now, it is precisely this lack of being bound to state and church that Now it is precisely this lack of being bound to state and church interests that philosophy is capable to serve as emissary of reason to make public use, that is, as Kant notes, as agent for the enlightenment of the public. As a result, philosophy and its critique serve as agents of enlightenment and emancipation. But Kant goes a step further. He frames his task of philosophers as that of free teachers to publicly instruct the people of their rights and duties as far as the state is concerned. This duty to the public use of reason is itself framed in a particular relation of the faculty of philosophy to the higher faculties. Now, Kant describes this setup in terms of a parliament of scholarship, or more precisely, a parliament of learning and knowledge, where the higher ranks are seated on the right side, defending the government's statutes. But as things go, Kant now maintains, and I quote, in a free constitution as one needs to be, that is dealing with truth, there needs to be an opposition party, and then the famous parenthesis opens on the left side, parenthesis closed, which is the bench of the philosophical faculty. Critique and Enlightenment are then, according to Kant, precisely not instruments designed to assume power, leadership, and high office, contrary to those wielding critique like a club to silence their opposition. Kant's vision of public use of reason doesn't establish rules, norms, and order. So there goes the current Frankfurt School. Rather, like a functioning opposition, it scrutinizes them, examines them, and exposes them to the free speech of public reasoning. And as a consequence, to the criteria and expectations of what constitutes a genuine free public sphere. This corrective use is what secures the emancipatory thrust of the project of the critique of pure reason, and Kant's legacy of the form and concept of critique in its unwavering openness. Reason, then, to conclude, has no time, no ear, and no tolerance for objections that seek to close it off in cataleptic stupor or in any sort of private use and abuse of reason, and to remain any longer relegated to returning to the voluntary minority, infancy, that is servitude, from which the project of critique was meant to emancipate us humans. Thank you.
Thank you, Willi. That was great. Anybody have a question? Sammy?
Not really a question, more of a comment. And first of all, thank you, Willi. That is perfect, because we have actually a roundtable on the public use of reason as I think the next event, right? So I think it was a beautiful introduction. Not introduction, I mean, it pointed out the stakes of what we are talking about. Very briefly, I think you know that I will probably agree to more or less everything you have said. But you also answered the question: are we still living in an age of critique? And if you say that the privatization of the public, and also the infringement on public use of reason, especially, we're not talking about America. Look at Germany, even the birthplace of Kant. I think then what is then the task of critique? The critique as, let's say, not something for the museum, but a living flame needs the public to live. If I take out all the oxygen for that flame, it will be for the museum. And of course, Kant is in the museum. His the celebration of his birthday is something that reminds us of the Museum of Thought, or maybe also the Intellectual Museum of Germany, that we maybe still try to memorize when we live in an age that where even public use of reason in the university, especially when you touch upon, so if you mention the word genocide in Germany, for instance, with regard to Gaza, then you already have reached the end of that. So I mean, how do we positively can exactly what you have said work ourselves back to the emancipatory potentials of critique, just as you have laid out, in an age which is an uncritical, non-critical age that has got rid of the public, where capitalism has eaten up that public sphere, and where power has become a cynical force of you may say ideology, fake news, and so on.
Right. Now you almost set me up to saying that, of course, Germany has become a museum, like the rest of Europe, almost, at least for North American. But but it's a nice museum sometimes. Not Germany, not so much maybe. I think that the key word for the answer would be in Kant, in that passage I kept quoting, the respect of that throne and altar cannot command any respect. And this is a something I'm working on now, because it goes through from Boétie to Mendelssohn on, but there's something in Kant which is there too. the idea that what we call buy-in today, like you cannot have a social, like you can't have a politics, and politics is nothing else than a social arrangement of how we live, the way we live. So if we define it that way, then if you don't have respect, if the respect isn't there, things will fall flat and will end up in a civil war, and that's all our fear, of course, right now across the world. So in that way, I think Kant's argument is that it's a bare necessity to actually have free speech going, and he's there very much together with also Spinoza, from whom and there are some connections there, that and it's the same argument that the anthropological feature of us is that we think and that we like to talk with each other, and if you cut that out, it's like you decide basically to cut out everybody's eyes or shut up their mouth, and so this is not sustainable. And so in that way, I agree with you, and just like writing this paper, I was just fascinated like how actually Marx's vocabulary nicely reflects in like some of the crucial features of how critique works. But at the same time, there is this pushback, and maybe the attempts to live off the cachet of critique is like a powerless way to try to tap into something for change. So if we indeed have no longer critique possible, we will have what Kant calls famously on Perpetual Peace, we have a real cemetery. We will have a graveyard, with like you as a zombies, which is, we already pretty close to it, with large groups of population, which seem to operate on that level, unfortunately. So that would be my answer, is like it's a necessity, and how to do it is of course an open question again, like how to reinvent it. But things are possible, like what you see is interesting also, like worldwide, like while the internet is turned into a real estate and colonized, of course, you see at the same time everywhere on the margins of that system, like counter voices coming up constantly, like playing it with it. So I don't have a short answer other than that if we get rid of critique, if we police it away, we will have precisely no form of respect of the law, or like Mendelssohn uses even a nicer word, Ansehen. No, we have no attention to the law. And if we don't have that, we can't live together. So that's, and that's why the libertarians are so happy. But this is, I think, what Kant has in mind. I don't know whether that helps in any way, but I think that's how hardwired Kant is, that this is like, it's directly like if you, and so he has this argument that it's like in the secret clause also of the Perpetual Peace, that it should be the unacknowledged secret of every politician that if you do not listen to what the public sphere, what the philosophy, he calls it there, but what people just like have to say, then it won't work. And if that sounds like a senseless argument, you only have to open Machiavelli. That's Machiavelli's argument. Like you can't, if you don't have the population in some way on your side, and the sustainable way is not fear. The sustainable way is the other way, which would be open discourse and all that. So, but where we are right now at this juncture is very hard to say. It's very hard to say whether we go completely down the drain or maybe not. Yeah.
Yeah, just to quickly follow up on that, I think one of the one of the things I appreciated about your talk was it kind of made me wonder, you know, have I personally ever had an experience with the public use of reason, or is this kind of a historical artifact that's actually, you know, it's actually totally alien to me or outside the frame of my experience. I think if the one of the questions I had was you said Marx recovers the political thrust of Kantian critique and its materially radical edge. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you mean by materially there.
Right. Materially, what I meant also is that with Kant, without the sense data perception, like if you're not, like you can't just like do the Cartesian split. You have to be embodied for Kant to have knowledge. And so and the embodiment then implies also, especially in Kant, some kind of, you know, politics about poverty, about redistribution, things like that. So I think in that way, like the sensus communis, all these ideas are very suggestive in Kant to attend to in that way the material. Marx takes then stresses that more into a particular way, but I would argue that in Kant's like the very setup of how knowledge works, it's already there, and I think that is sort of an interesting moment. With the other question you had, which I think is interesting, is that we could also argue whether the Enlightenment ever had a public sphere, because you have to remember that only 5% of the population there could actually read, and how many could actually afford buying newspapers and so forth, or reading them in reading cabinets is also a question. And that's the other really important moment in Kant, that like the epistemological political status of what is an idea. That idea means it doesn't have to exist, and the argument that it doesn't exist is not an argument against the idea, and that has a very strong political power. That in that way, yes, it's a project maybe, or an idea, and maybe the public sphere we would have to reinvent very differently. And in some way, when we look back, we may have never seen it. The Enlighteners never may have seen it, actually.
Claudia.
Hi, yeah, Willi, that was just a really wonderful talk. So thank you for that. I want to just say, Sammy, of course, that was the pertinent question. And I'm just going to say this, although it won't give you the answer that you want, that returning to how Willi began this paper, that, and I want, Willi, the exact reference to that line in Marx. You said it's a hidden work of Marx's, which I don't know where that occurs, that statement. Genuine critique doesn't analyze the answers, but the questions. Now, even though it will seem, as it does to all of us now, such a futile gesture, given the complete privatization of the public sphere, the fact that you, this is very, you know, it's no consolation, Sammy, but the fact that you are asking that question, and that we all encounter people who are asking that question, not just in an academic sphere, who are cynical about what they understand to be now the so-called public sphere. And that, for example, in the United States, a very long time ago, because of certain power configurations, speech became money, right? They became the same thing. All of it is extraordinary. And that became a precedent and a legal judgment. The fact that you can have in any way the agency of and this I owe to Willi, because I had never thought of this before in all my many years reading these critiques, and I'm going to get to that in a second, that you can have the agency of, and whatever that is, and it may fill you with sadness and despair, to commit to asking even that question, how could we, how can we, is very different from being devoured by the current condition. So if you think of what Willi just said was also very interesting. It was a nice discrimination, pure reason, whatever that is, and in the end it ends up to be freedom, which is what you find out in the second critique. If you think of pure reason, not as knowing things in themselves, but the only one that really interests him being freedom, as not a property but a practice, you see, then that is the public aspect per se of this thing called pure reason, which is the thing he did take from Rousseau, which is that there's one, all of us can freely alienate ourselves from our property, and that's called a contract. In some weird moment, which has no antecedent, somehow we just, in what he calls the instant of total alienation, we sign on to this contract, which is sort of like creating a public sphere as opposed to one of permanent and increasing inequality. Whatever that is, we do have access to it. You've just proven, Sammy, that of course you have access to it. It doesn't mean, but it's also something that Kant keeps saying, well, you're not asking the right questions if you just presume that it has been completely devoured. But you are asking the right question. So you just did ask the right question. And that's in Marx's view as well as in Kant's. And about that business about asking questions, that is the first sentence of the first preface to the first critique, that Sammy, yourself, man has this strange besonderes Schicksal, right, has this strange fate of asking questions for which it cannot provide the answers. That's just it. I mean, there was censorship in Kant's time, so that he had to do sort of kind of gestures of obeisance, right, to whoever was the monarch, who would be the monarch in charge when his works were published or republished. Rousseau obviously was exiled from, like, from land to land to land. And his works were burned right after he'd been celebrated for the first discourse. A few years later, second discourse, get out of here. And these things are burned, banned by the Parliament of France. And that was wrought upon what had been a person who had become the greatest international celebrity in enlightened Europe, right? But I mean, that's all in a sense, that's all I really want to say, except this very cute thing you did, Willi, which I don't remember. Even your Constituting Critique, Willi's first book on Kant, I don't think you provide this, maybe I missed it, but I read it a couple of times, but this idea that the genitive, which I have never thought about, grammatically speaking, it means that indeed, if it's the critique of pure reason, then it is taking pure reason as an object, or it states that pure reason is what's doing the critique. That's correct. Grammatically, that's correct. And I never thought of it that way. And it's always been difficult, even despite your book, for anyone to identify what was the revolution in thinking for Kant, because he had written such different things before that made it possible for him to think epistemology will have to be delimited in order for politics to be unlimited. That's what he understood, that one was going to, in a sense, free the other, right? The limitations of one were going to free the other. It was a completely brilliant move. Whereas if you conflate the two, you just end up no place, right? That's a very, I mean, there's no agency whatsoever in conflating the two. That does finally erode into a question of pure power, and the power overtakes the epistemology, and that's Foucault's entire career. But the fact is that, supposing this is about agency and his own revolution in thinking, which he doesn't even attribute to himself, but clearly he's committing one, is one of these untraceable, without antecedent. He calls it spontan, right? He calls it spontaneity. Thinking is free, it's spontaneous. Whatever it is, it seems to be available and universally available. And one last thing, even though we're all filled with enormous despair, there is, like, we have this technology which has allowed us all to meet now. It also allows all kinds of complete capitalizations. But, Adorno makes this clever line in aesthetic theory. He says, ideology, yes, well, ideology is itself, the very word ideology means that you are in some way free of ideology, because you're understanding it not as truth, but as something purporting to be true in epistemology, which is actually an ideology. That, you understand, even the ability to conceptualize the difference between ideology and truth, which only comes through in the coining of this word ideology, he says, means that you are not under the sway of ideology, if you can name it even. You see what I'm saying? It's a tiny critical move that he makes. So yes, we're all under the sway of ideology, and that is something to despair of. And yet we understand in some way that again, this is not a translation into praxis, but the pure, and it is a pure ability, which I myself can't fathom that we have it, but we have it. The pure ability, which remains sort of resistant to absolute capitalization, which everybody feels, whether it's in the mode of cynicism or the mode of irony or this ridiculous fluorescence of stand-up comedy. You see, everybody in some way is taking their own distance from what they know to be going on. How to translate that into a revolution in thinking, no one has given us the answer to that precisely, but it is the question. By the way, does anyone know what the great translation was for Marx? How he turns the formula of capital into you understand, how does he turn commodity, how does he turn CMC into MCM? Does anybody know? When did all that is a Kantian move. Instead of this being the framework, oh no, the middle is the framework. The mediator money is actually the framework. That's a completely Kantian move. And from whence, that's the point of departure, really. And that's what makes the dialectic into a critique of capitalism, as opposed to a classic description of capitalism with its little flaws or something like that. I don't know. That's just what I wanted to say, that we can despair, and we are despairing. And, in the United States right now in particular, but censorship has always been there. Sorry, but it's always been there. And it will be. It will be. There's no question it will be. That's all I wanted to say. But thank you. Just to repeat again, Willi, thank you for it was a great talk. Really great.
Thank you. Yeah.
Did you want to respond to any of that, Willi? Or does somebody else have that?
Well, just by thanking, it was a very nice, it clarified, I think, also further, I hope Sam is concerned that we all share. So I don't have to qualify or add, or I just take it as a gift. Thank you.
Well, I want a quotation from Marx, though. I want to know the source of that
quotation. The quotation, it's actually in the chapter. It pops up in the...
It does? Okay, yeah. Then it'll be source. Thank you. Okay. Yeah. But it's the first sentence that Kant wrote of critique. That is the first sentence. That is the first sentence of the first preface. So thank you.
Yeah.
Well, if there are no further questions, should we wrap up?
Yeah. Well, thank you again very much for having the chance.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I think we all did. And yeah, as Sammy said, it's really setting us up very well for our next event.
Yes. Thank you,
Um,
Willi.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you. Yes. So when is your next event? When is that?
March 21st, right?
Yeah.
Yes, March 21st on public use of reason. I think at AUB, right? AUB around late afternoon, 5 p.m. on a Friday. In
And-
person.
Oh, no links, no virtuality. Yeah.
Well, we could discuss it, but yeah, so far I
I'll
think it's
come
gonna
to
be
Beirut for sure. And then
What?
yeah, I'll come to Beirut.
Mm-hmm.
That would be nice.
Yeah,
Hi,
thank you
Claudia.
so much again. Yeah.
So nice to see you.
You too.
Yes.
Only just read your email now, so that's my mistake.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And I was saying, where's the Zoom link? And then I found it.
Devan, are you raising your hand? Or maybe that was just a clapping hand gesture. Okay.
I just wanted to say bye before I'm leaving.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sammy.
Bye. Thank you.
Take care.
Sorry,
Yes. Bye.
I'm new to WebEx, so I meant to clap, but I
Yeah.
It's like it's like, can you raise your hand and clap at the same time? That's some kind of like thought experiment. Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you. Yeah. Take care. Yes. Yeah. Now it's back to shoveling some more snow up here. Okay. Take care and
Bye.
thank you,
Yeah,
Mary.
you too. Thank you so much. Okay,
Take
bye
care.
everybody.
Bye bye.